It is with pleasure that I now introduce David Matthews, who's the Interim Coordinator General for Family Safety.
It's wonderful to see you all here this morning, and I can sense a fantastic vibe in the room. I think you're going to have a wonderful event over these next couple of days, so I really encourage you to make the most of it and enjoy each other's company in our beautiful city of Canberra. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to acknowledge the ongoing contribution that they make to the life of our city and our region. Obviously, domestic violence is a key issue for the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander community, and we all have an important role in playing in addressing violence in that community and the things that lead to that violence. I think your conference theme is fantastic, Stop DV, where does it start? Because that really is the key question. I think over the last several decades, we've had some fantastic law reform and service delivery responses to the prevalence of violence in our community. We've been less focused and less successful at identifying the causes and addressing them. So I think the fact that you are focusing debate and discussion around those issues is fantastic. As we all know in this room, family violence is a widespread social problem that does affect our entire society, whether you are directly affected or not. It doesn't discriminate on the basis of age, income levels, educational levels or culture, and it's experienced in cities, towns and rural communities across the nature. So it truly is a national issue, and it does affect us all. I'm worried about promoting an environment of statistic fatigue in this area, because we hear statistics and they almost become normalised for us. But the key statistic that I would raise with you today, the two I would raise, is that 1/3 of Australian women have experienced violence by somebody that is known to them. So that's 1/3 of our entire female population. That is pause for thought in of itself. And on average, one Australian woman is killed by their former or current partner each week, and in fact the prevalence of that has been increasing over the last 2 years. And as recently as today in the media, there are very high profile and tragic examples of family violence that result in the worst possible consequence, which is the early loss of life of women and children. In the ACT, we are the richest, healthiest, most actively involved community in Australia. We've got the highest educational levels, the highest income levels, but we still have family violence in our community. And I think it's important as a community for us to say that, both to acknowledge that truth, but also to avoid the stigmatisation and generalisation that often is accompanied around this issue. So it is an issue for us, as it is an issue for other communities in Australia. In 2014-15, the last full financial year where reports available, the ACT policing actually attended over 2,500 family violence events in the ACT. So that's very significant for a size of our community, which is around just under 400,000 at the moment. And from that, of course, charges were laid, people were brought before the courts, and the Director of Public Prosecution commenced 517 individual criminal proceedings. And of course, that's where the engagement with the justice system just begins, and where your role comes in. My background actually is in a range of different areas, including housing and homelessness, but I've also had a couple of years in youth justice and been responsible for community corrections for young people. So your work has a great affinity to me, and I appreciate the efforts and the skill that's required to do your job well. And really that focus on ensuring that people address the reason for their offending behaviour, that they have an opportunity for rehabilitation and to stay connected to the community. So I wanted to thank you for all of your work and your interest in domestic violence as being a critical part of the offending pattern, but the life stories of people that are being involved in the justice system. In the ACT, our story really most recently commenced around a series of high-profile deaths through 2015 and 16, which led to the ACT government commissioning 3 separate reviews into family violence, which tried to look at the issue from a number of different perspectives. And I think that that's important because family and domestic violence is not a one-dimensional issue, and it's very important that we don't draw very broad conclusions and therefore have one-size-fits-all approaches. So the ACT government's reviews looked at a couple of specific focal points. One of them was about the interface between family violence and the care and protection system, which is of course a really important area of public policy and service delivery. And that concept of intersectionality or the relationship between different statutory systems is really critical to understanding how we can best respond to the issue as it emerges. Another one of our reviews was an analysis of 11 deaths that were a result of family violence, and to provide a case history and a study of their life stories and the circumstances that led to their death. Of course, that made for incredibly sobering reading, and it was very tragic. It highlighted, though, the complexity of the issue. Not only were there very clear examples of inter-partner violence represented there, but also violence between children and their parents, and also from parents to children, and also same-sex related violence. So when we start to think about how domestic violence plays out, we've got to understand the complexity and the variety of those circumstances. The third review was a gap analysis, which really looked at our current service delivery and looked at where we were doing well and also where we needed to focus our efforts further. All of the reports really showed a fundamental lack of understanding about the extent and underlying causes of family violence in our community, which is disturbing on one level and not surprising on another. So it really showed that we needed to focus on community education and prevention as much as we needed to focus on providing a justice-based and a service delivery response. All of the reports highlighted challenges around information sharing, and that is really being able to provide real-time responses to people, particularly where their circumstances are changing rapidly and the things that we might be having in place for them are no longer going to be effective, and we need to do something differently, but we need to have an information sharing arrangement which enables that response to take place. The reports showed that frontline workers in schools, workplaces, health services, GPs weren't actually identifying family violence as part of their work. So they might have been in a counselling relationship with somebody that was using violence in their family context, but they actually weren't identifying. It wasn't visible in the case file notes, or even where it was identified in the file notes, it was identified as a factor that might relate, for example, to a breach of an order of the court. So it was dealt with as a compliance issue rather than a behavioural issue, or certainly something that might be posing risk to other people. So it just shows again about how our role and how we see our role is fundamental to how we're actually both identifying and addressing family violence, and that very much did cut across the board. There were other real dimensions around the fact that domestic violence, family violence takes place in the personal sphere, and people were very uncomfortable about not knowing what the boundary of that personal sphere is. And, the language and ideas of this is a private matter, I don't want to embarrass somebody, I'm not sure what to do, they were very strong and common themes that were coming through when people were seeking to address family violence. And I think the point we would make very strongly is violence, and family violence is a crime. Whether somebody does a king hit on a street in front of a nightclub, it makes no difference if they are to do the same thing to their partner in their lounge room. It is a violent act, it is a criminal act, and it needs to be dealt with and seen in that context, as well as understanding the issues that are leading to that and what we can do to prevent it. So the ACT government, in response to all of that work, put together a whole of government strategy, and we're not alone, of course. Queensland, Victoria's had their Royal Commission, and many others are forming what amounts to a national movement, I think, around addressing domestic and family violence, which is very positive to see. There's a lot of commonality in all of the approaches that are being implemented across different governments, and they all start with this idea that we need to prevent as well as respond to family violence as it emerges. Our reports identified 5 particular themes of activities which shapes our whole of government community response, and really they emphasise the importance of leadership and cultural change, prevention and early intervention activities, information sharing, collaboration and transparency and accountability. So it's very important that the community understands and is informed about what is being done, and the efforts are reported back to the community. The government's response included the establishment of the first full-time Coordinator General for Family Safety to lead that process, to implement collaborative responses through a dedicated family safety hub with a focus on safety monitoring and planning, so really looking at that issue of personal safety management, to provide an authorising legal framework, including around information sharing, and to do workforce and education strategies to really uplift the capability of our system to respond effectively to family violence. The ACT Public Service is the second largest employer in the ACT as well, so we've also taken our responsibilities as a large employer and have included domestic violence leave in our enterprise bargaining agreement arrangements. And we've also got a program to support our managers to be able to address violence as experienced by people that work for us. So it's very easy often to think about our community mission and think about what we're trying to do to influence positive change, but in our workforce of around 23,000 ACT public servants that include teachers, firefighters, nurses, general public servants, there are going to be significant portions of people that are experiencing family violence themselves. In the last budget, we boosted our efforts by over $21 million, but we also did that through a family safety levy, which was applied to our rates. So every property owner in the ACT contributes to the funding of these initiatives through a $30 ongoing levy on their rates. Now, that's not without some degree of controversy. Some would argue that these sorts of initiatives should be funded from the budget, but what it does have the effect of doing is giving every household a stake in actually funding solutions around family violence, and it also highlights or elevates its level of importance. So we're used to things like emergency services levy, and it really does highlight a level of importance that the ACT government is placing on effectively responding to family violence. I mentioned information sharing, and that might be a theme that you are interested in exploring or not, but I know that in your day-to-day work that will be clearly one of the challenges you're facing. How do you work and collaborate with others? The ACT government is looking at its current privacy legislation and working out whether we think it needs to be amended to better facilitate a positive culture of information sharing. All of our reviews said that there was, in fact, the opposite, that if people could find a reason not to share information, even where it was they were legally able to do so, they didn't. And they did that for a range of different reasons, concern about client confidentiality, but also whether it was their role to do something about it or not. But fundamentally what it meant was that information that was available to the system wasn't being able to be used to appropriately respond to safety concerns. So we need to, of course, balance up the right to privacy, and we are a human rights jurisdiction, with the right to safety, and find the right balance which helps us support this pro-disclosure information culture that we want to establish where it's necessary, as well as have the necessary safeguards in place. Our other legislative reform program includes a new Family Violence Act, which was passed by our Assembly in August, and amendments to the Residential Tenancies Legislation and Discrimination Act. So under our Res 10 legislation, a victim of family violence can break a lease without financial penalty. They can also apply to our tribunal to have their name substituted onto the lease. And this tries to go to this basic issue about why do victims of violence have to leave the family home and then us have to do a crisis-based response when in fact for the stability of children often it's better that they remain at home, supported by legislation and relevant safety measures to be able to do so. The ACT government's discrimination legislation now explicitly says that it's illegal to discriminate against somebody on the basis that they are a victim of family violence. So it's a new grounds for discrimination in our legislation. Just going back to the theme of your conference and in conclusion, I just wanted to touch on our Act in a little bit more detail because it goes to this question of where does it start? And when in our new Family Violence Act, what we've done is put in a new definition of family violence in law to capture behaviours that are known to be family violence, including a broader range of emotional, psychological and economic abuse, which haven't necessarily always been reflected in legislation. Our legislation also specifically recognises the effect that family violence has on children, even if they are not the victim of violence themselves, but as witnesses of violence. We've improved the way that our system of domestic violence orders can take place, including the ability for orders to happen after hours, and our magistrates are concerned about being woken up in the middle of the night, but both police can make orders on behalf of victims, and after hours can be sought now at any time where that's required. And we've also introduced a framework for national recognition of family violence orders, as is being worked through by the Council of Australian Governments. The definition of family violence, very importantly, not only covers physical violence and abuse, which is seen to be largely what family violence is about, and largely between domestic partners. It includes physical violence or abuse, sexual violence or abuse, emotional or psychological abuse, economic abuse, threatening behaviour, and coercion and control, and behaviour that specifically leads to children experiencing or witnessing violence. So I think that's very important, because that goes back to where does it start. I referred earlier to our death review that was undertaken. What was one of the most shocking elements of a shocking report was that in many of those instances there was no recorded physical violence before the person was murdered. So that whilst there was some evidence of controlling and coercive behaviour, and quite long established patterns of that behaviour in some instances, the actual first time a violent event took place was on the day that the person died. And what that shows is that we have to understand how corrosive those behaviours are to people's individual well-being and their relationships, but also that the risk that they can pose to an escalation, particularly at key points, and this is where, again, you'll have lots of experience. In the case of Tara Costigan, which has been one of our high-profile deaths that's been, that the family have very generously shared with our community through public events and the media, that death was prompted by a DVO order being served on the person that's been convicted for that crime. So that event in of itself changed that risk profile for Tara Costigan, and whilst there had been no physical violence leading up to it, that was the trigger or the tipping point. So it really shows that that notwithstanding the complexity of this issue and the different ways that it does manifest, we really need to get to the bottom of all of the circumstances and drivers that are leading to risk in particular, that are leading to safety risk. It's not all about lethality. Obviously, a lethal event is the most critical and obvious example of failure, but many people live with violence or forms of violence for extended periods of time, and that has similar effect and damage in their lives. So the variety of the circumstances that I've talked about today are all family violence, and they all require our understanding and our intention. And like your conference is very clear about saying, we need to look at where it starts in order to prevent it. The ACT's, under its package, has done a number of perpetrator-based interventions, particularly a new initiative that we're implementing called the Room for Change program, which is broadly based on the WA breathing space model, except that it's, rather than being a referral from the justice system, it's aiming to have a self-referral model of men that are themselves recognising in an earlier intervention sense that they are using poor behaviours. It's a mixture of residential, group work and case management support, which also allows then the victim or in this case the woman to remain in her family home and supported in her family home with security upgrades as well. So it's supposed to be designed deliberately as a holistic family intervention which both supports the perpetrator as well as allows the victim to feel supported in the community. We're working with our colleagues in corrections, and we're looking forward to that partnership, and also we see a great opportunity to work with the child protection system as part of that particular initiative. We're also doing a justice reinvestment trial for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, and that really is about focusing on a coordinated family support initiative, which is looking very holistically at the circumstances of those individual families and to make sure that support is coordinated and culturally appropriate. Already, of course, there is the ACT's Through Care initiative, which is really focusing in on how people in the criminal justice system, the correction system, are being supported to transition from custodial and community-based environments into the community more generally, and the learnings from that will be adapted and used throughout the development of all of our initiatives. So I really wanted to thank you today for giving me the opportunity to tell you what's happening in our community, because you're meeting in our land, on the land of the Ngunnawal people. But I'm sure across this room there is a wealth of knowledge and expertise about the variety of things that are happening across the country, and that's what we need to do. We need to look at the issue from first principle, we need to learn from each other, we need to understand the evidence, and we need to build the evidence base, particularly in perpetrator-based programs, and then we need to work together to implement the solutions. So I hope you have a wonderful few days, and I congratulate you on all of your efforts and the organisers in coming together around this very important issue. So thank you.